Welcome back to the Cineposium podcast, where each week members or collaborators of Cineposium curate films for remote viewing, and then talk about those films on this podcast. In this week's episode, Alexx and Reed Williams discuss Takashi Miike's picture, Ichi the Killer. Enjoy the conversation.
So today, Alexx and myself, Reed Williams, we're going to discuss Ichi the Killer. It's its 20th anniversary, we found out, so that lined up pretty nicely with wanting to do this episode. And from what I understand, Alexx, this is definitely a film you've been working with in your research, and so I'm definitely excited to talk to you more about it.
Yeah, I'm excited as well because this is actually one of my favorite Miike films. Like this, I like Audition is like the film by Miike that like everyone like seems to kind of have like an awareness of. That's the film that like Tarantino was like really inspired by. So like Audition tends to be the one that gets thrown around, but I'm really excited to be able to talk about a totally different one because Ichi the Killer is just like one of my favorites. So I'm very excited. I love working with it.
Yeah, no, it seems perfect for the kind of work you do and then horror studies. So yeah, without further ado, you want to just give us some background on the plot and kind of what the film's about?
Yeah, so I will do my best because this is a hulking 2.5 hour runtime film, which I don't get to work with that very often. Like the majority of the films that I tend to work with are running about like an hour and 20 minutes tops. That's just kind of the nature of the genre. But then, Miike comes out and he's like, you know what, I'm gonna do this for 2.5 hours. And it's gonna be like the wildest 2.5 hours you've ever seen in your life. So it's, to my understanding, it's actually inspired by a manga that is also called Ichi the Killer. I haven't read the manga. I don't know anything about it really other than the fact that it apparently exists and this is an adaptation of it. I don't know, again, like I'm not sure how loose of an adaptation. If this is accurate to the manga, then like Miike's, he's picked like the perfect manga because I've never seen like any kind of content that looks anything like this, so it's very unique in that sense. But so I can't really speak to the manga content. But Ichi the Killer, the film, I generally consider it to be like an action crime thriller. Like that's kind of like how it plays to me, as opposed to, say, like if you're going into this film thinking that it's going to be like Hostel or Saw, it's very different. There's a lot of like genre bending that's happening here that is kind of like characteristic for Miike films and for like East Asian extreme cinema just in general. There's a lot of overlap with melodrama and crime, and then you got like gore and like 8,000 different things happening at once, and it's so overwhelming, but for some reason it works. The basic premise of the film is it's involving the Yakuza, and there's two rivaling Yakuza gangs who are at war with each other. And there is a man, we'll call him an otaku. He's an otaku, and his name is Ichi, and he has been manipulated into intervening essentially in this Yakuza gang war. Psychically manipulated, mentally I'm not sure quite, like that's a part that doesn't quite get to me, but yeah, so Ichi the Killer comes in and he starts killing members of the gang, being manipulated into doing so. And the result is that he kills one particular Yakuza boss named Anju, and Anju's enforcer is the one that like you picture. So like Ichi the Killer is not actually the guy who's on the poster for the film. Like if you're thinking of like the film and you're seeing like the blonde hair and the piercings and stuff, that's not actually Ichi. That's actually it's
I'd forgotten about that. I was like, oh yeah.
It's like the biggest plot twist of the movie is that it's not named after the main character. so, so that's actually the Yakuza boss Anju's, that's his enforcer, Kakihara. And Kakihara is like the character that like we're focusing on, even though like it's named after Ichi the Killer. So it's basically we're following Kakihara, and we're occasionally getting a little bit of like perspective from Ichi going on. But so Kakihara kind of like exists to avenge Anju, and he's expecting Ichi the Killer to be this like really just like really vicious dude, because he killed the most vicious Yakuza boss. And the reality just isn't that. So it ends up like it's like a cat and mouse. So like Kakihara is like attempting to find Ichi, and Ichi doesn't even know that he's like in a position to be found. And so it's like leading up to this huge showdown between Kakihara and Ichi, and the result is like one of the most like anticlimactic showdowns in like all of filmic history, which is also phenomenal. But that's like, yeah, that's the basic rundown of the plot, and of course there's a lot that goes on in the midst of that, with like particularly like the torture comes with like Kakihara attempting to gather information from rivaling like Yakuza members, and Ichi throughout is continuously coming face to face with other Yakuza members who he's killing. And there's a lot. It felt like it doesn't need to be 2.5 hours, but then like it feels like it does need to be 2.5 hours. It's an interesting kind of slog. Definitely let me know what you think about it, because it's interesting. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, no, I liked how you summarized that, because I did get lost sometimes in some of the like particular um I guess actions that happen within the plot, and wasn't sure like how they connected, or like who even certain characters were at some point. So it just helps to know basically that it's like these two rival gangs hashing it out, and um as far as the runtime and just the plot itself, how it can be kind of convoluted and difficult to follow. And I do wonder if that is due to it being adapted from a manga. And I haven't read it either, and I actually just haven't read much like manga in general. But from what I know of like anime and those kinds of stories, they do tend to pack a lot of plot into into their films or books, or media in general. So it does make sense why it has that runtime and why it packs so much, because it's adapting like what I assume is sort of a multi-volume manga into a 2 hour plus film. So it's helpful to have that kind of context behind it. And I'm glad you brought up genre too, because that was actually a question I had while watching the film, like what genre is this? Because I know you work with torture porn a lot. You mentioned Hostel. I know you work with Saw, and like other forms of extreme cinema. Um, so yeah, that's sort of what my mindset was. And I had seen this film previously, but I completely forgot about it. I just remembered like all the ultra violent stuff, right? And I didn't really appreciate until this time how it does binge genre, like you mentioned. Like it is this crime thriller, this cat and mouse game, like a mystery, because at one point Kakihara is convinced that like his boss isn't dead, so he's trying to find him. So it's like it is all these things, and then within it, there's this sort of commentary about sex, violence, masculinity. So yeah, I was just thinking about you and your work the whole time, because I'm like, oh, this is like totally perfect for what Alexx does. So yeah, I'm definitely curious to hear how you've been integrating it into the research and work you've already been doing.
Yeah, and I love this film for like so many reasons, but like one of them is that like I wouldn't say that it's like rare that you get like an extreme cinema piece that has like such depth, because I think like to try to claim that, you'd be I don't know, like stepping on the toes of like Lars von Trier or something like that. But like it is rare. Like you don't really get films that have this much stuff going on, because I mean like even something like yeah, like Lars von Trier's films, they're usually like one subject, like we're in one genre, that genre is art house, and we're gonna just kind of follow like one linear plot throughout the entire thing with like a very small cast. And so with there being so much going on, there's a lot of different ways that I've been kind of like approaching this. And I'm kind of like the two main places that like I'm really super interested in the film doing is the commentary on masculinity, like you said, because like that, like the way that it's constructed in this is just absolutely like one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen on screen. And then queerness, and then also its differences in its portrayals of violence, because like you have two really distinct types of violence happening in this film stylistically. You have like this hyper realistic, almost like over the top realistic practical effect violence that's happening and is kind of surrounding the character of Kakihara. And so like any of the torture porn that's happening there is practical effects. It looks super violent. And it's kind of like clashing against this really like cartoonish superhero, almost like it's almost like a super, like parts of this is almost a superhero film, right? It's high CGI, which with the film being 20 years old, celebrating the 20th anniversary, the CGI doesn't always look the greatest, but I wouldn't have it any other way because it kind of emphasizes this cartoonish stylized violence that's going on, and that's surrounding Ichi. And every so often you get these scenes where the two kind of combine and like clash against each other, and like that's what upsets Ichi. Like every time Ichi like goes off mentally, it's whenever like the real violence comes up against this like fictionalized violence. So I'm interested in tracking the different modes of violence and what that means, and then also the sexuality and the gender in the film, because wow, phenomenal.
Yeah, yeah. To speak to that point about the different types of violence, I was glad that you mentioned that to me, kind of in our little preliminary chat just online, and it did sort of inform a little bit some some of the way I watched the film because it shows Ichi playing video games, like, and specifically, I think like a fighting video game, or at least like a violent one. And at first, I was like, "Oh, is this like a blame the video games almost kind of argument?" Like, but I think really that's what kind of clued me into what you're talking about. Like, oh, like um, it's to show you how he perceives this violence, and like you said, it is very like cartoonish and like almost fake, like not real. Like the stakes are lower because it's not actually real. And you definitely see that in one particular scene where he Ichi kills this pimp, right? And just the way that he kills him, I can't even do it justice in describing it. You would just have to see it, but it is almost campy, I feel like, And like you said, he is dressed up like a superhero. He has like this superhero outfit, which I think does, that also lines up with the video games and with um, the situation he's in where he thinks he's like being a hero. It also just fits in with Miike in general because I believe he's done some superhero films as well as these kind of extreme, cinema. So yeah, it is just all of that together does it's a difficult watch at points, but it is definitely compelling because all the stuff you're talking about that's in the background.
Yeah, there's always like a point about like halfway through the film, and it's always like around like the hour mark or like 40-minute mark where you've like reached the halfway point of the film, and you're like, oh, we're gonna keep going for another hour and a half. Because like you reach this point, there's a couple scenes, like, because the film is kind of really fast paced, all things considering that it is, so long. You would think that it would be like really kind of drawn out, but the reality is that there's like 1,000 different things happening in like every single scene, and like by the time you reach the 40-minute mark, there's been like so much like torture and violence and death, and like a couple different like you're like, there's no way that they can keep up this pace. But they do, and they just keep going with it, and it's fantastic, but it's very exhausting. Like I always have to kind of take this film into two watch sessions because I get overwhelmed by the first half because I'm like, okay, well, I just saw all of this stuff. What's next?
That's exactly how I did it too. I watched like a little bit last night before I went to sleep, and then yeah, it got to a point where it was like getting late, and I was like, I'm gonna pick this up tomorrow because like you said, it does it kind of ratchets up too. You know what I mean? And luckily there are some like humorous moments too, like albeit like pretty dark humor. But just to call one out, I love when Kakihara and like kind of his two mentees that he's kind of like trained to be like, you know, sociopathic killers, like basically are on a hit job, and then the guy's running from like his two buddies and comes out and sees Kakihara like watering the plants, and he's just like, oh, okay. And then they have this super gruesome fight, but just like, you know, seeing him like being kind of tender and taking care of these plants amidst like him just, you know, performing like horrendous torture on people is, you know, I got a chuckle out of it for sure, which you know, helps to break up the, you know, onslaught of violence on screen.
Yeah, there's like a lot of humor in this film. Like it's really like that's what makes it to me like very Miike is because like there is a lot of this really dark humor. Like one of my favorite moments is they're in the torture room and he's just finished he's hung up one of the rival Yakuza members. He's suspended him from the ceiling with a bunch of piercings in his back and he's been dumping boiling oil onto him and it's like this huge like really like strenuous scene and you're like seeing every graphic detail and like one of the other bosses comes in and is like, what are you doing? And he's like, just a little torture, just a little torture. And they're like, just a little torture.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing?
I know he looks like a kid who's like gotten caught, you know, like playing with fire or something. Like, I'm not doing anything bad.
Exactly, it's so good. And then there's like a lot of that kind of like weird comedy to it too with a couple of like Ichi's deaths. Like there's he goes into a apartment building. Like I can like picture the scene and I can't like think of the details. But he's like inside of an apartment complex and he goes inside of a building and like the camera shows him going inside of the apartment building and then there's like a bunch of screams and like blood shooting out of the door. And it's like it's very like slapstick and you're like, what is this? And it's like all CGI blood as well. So it's like it looks really pixelated and like bad coming out of the door.
No, totally. Yeah, I love those moments. And then I feel like also mixed in with those moments, it's like he's also implicating the viewer because it's like, you know, occasionally it'll cut to like, you know, there's these two guys like watching Kakihara at one point like torture someone because they like had set up videos, or you know, you see Ichi at one point like peering through, you know, a screen door while like sexual assault is happening. So it does like there's that whole idea of voyeurism and like, oh, we're basically doing the same thing. Like we're watching a movie and enjoying like watching this kind of stuff take place. So it is interesting how that humor is there, but how it does sort of like implicate the viewer in the violence as well. Like kind of like I feel like the best of these kind of films do, like Funny Games or like Clockwork Orange or what have you.
Yeah, it's very it a lot of like the scenes of like voyeurism that are like commented on. It feels very almost uh I can only think of the De Palma remake, Body Double. It feels very Body Double, where it's like you know that you're watching this and that you're watching it alongside the character, and but like you're enjoying it with that character as like that medium, despite like the horrendous nature of the content. And yeah, I think in that way it is like really effective, like Funny Games, right? Where it's like how how far can we push this before it stops being, you know, an entertainment piece and it starts being, you know, this just really like painful film to try to watch, because every single character is bad. There is no good character in this like at all. Like you have like some characters that like are a little bit lesser um perpetrators of violence, but at the same time like the whole cast is criminals. And you know, it's like at what point is this like are you sitting here and you're like, do I want like any of these people to survive, or like like what is the outcome that like
Yeah.
you're hoping for when you watch this, you know?
Yeah, yeah. That's such a great point. And I feel like it does sort of lead into one of the things you referenced earlier, just you know, the idea of masculinity and violence. And one thing I kind of got from the film is just how that violence is passed on or learned by other men or boys in the film. And I think that like comes to a head at sort of the very end where you see like and I wasn't sure who like this little boy was exactly, but he, watches this big showdown that you're talking about, and then like participates in like kicking Ichi, and then all throughout it's like there's um commentary on sort of like men mentoring other men to be violent in a way. And mentoring sounds like a weird word, but I think it works because I mentioned like Kakihara and his two buddies that have like the weird masks and just perform these brutal murders, and they talk about how he basically taught them everything they know. Um, and then you've got Ichi and like his handler who I wasn't quite sure who he was, but he's the one that's basically like manipulating him to like to take out these like um syndicates, right? These are and so that almost kind of reminded me of Barry a little bit, just because I sort of watched that fairly recently, and just like the relationship between Barry and Stephen Root's character is sort of this guy teaching him how to be a hitman, and then of course you've got like the kids too, and so yeah, I got this feeling that he's kind of commenting on how like violence begets violence, and how it's a learned thing. Um, so yeah, I'm definitely curious to hear kind of your thoughts on that for sure.
Yeah, you've got it like 100% hit on the head, and I think that it's super emphasized also between Karen, who is the English speaking Chinese sex worker that Kakihara kind of teams up with for a little bit to try to get information about Ichi. In like some of the earlier scenes with Karen, there's a scene where Kakihara is trying to encourage her and try to teach her how to properly like punish him in a sadomasochistic relationship that he's trying to like get her involved in. He sees her, torture by like pulling at like essentially like pull off a guy's face as part of their information gathering scheme, and Kakihara sees this and is like, oh, okay, you're capable of the kind of violence that I need in order to get off. But unfortunately she's not, right? Like Kakihara is like very disappointed in her inability to like actually like fulfill what his idea is of like pure cruelty that he needs in order to get off. And so like it's almost like an extended commentary on um not just this violence being something that is teachable, but the violence is something that is specifically teachable only to men. And women who have the capacity for cruelty don't have this same capacity for cruelty, that this is like something that like is specifically masculine, that just cannot be replicated no matter how hard that Karen tries. And that's like really interesting to me as well. I'm not a like a cultural critic of Japan. I don't have like the knowledge to be able to kind of like engage with it on that level. But I'm sure that this all has something to do on a much larger scale with kind of maybe like domestic violence laws in Japan. We see a lot of that. There's a lot of like domestic abuse. With Ichi being an otaku, like the implication is that uh, he's kind of like this incel type character, right? And so there's like a commentary on that as well that's going on in there, and the kind of violence that specifically this kind of incel character can produce in relation to women. And so there's just like, yeah, there's like a lot of like violence on different levels, and it's not just like the torture, it's like systematic violence. And it's societal violence, and it's perpetuated through like generations, because part of like Ichi's reason why he's killing and the way that they're manipulating him is because he had when he was in high school, he like saw a girl getting raped and like didn't intervene in that and like didn't stop it, right? So like there's like this whole like it's happening always, constantly, at all generations, at all levels. And eventually it escalates and you get mob violence, right? You get the Yakuza, right? So yeah, it's wow.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the term otaku. Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. That's a term I've heard a couple times, and I feel like I've like, Googled it and then swiftly forgotten what it means. Could you give us like a basic definition of that? Because I am curious to learn more about that. I know that's like there's like a whole sort of like culture and um, philosophy almost behind it. So I'd be curious to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so otaku is kind of a term that's changed really recently. So when I'm speaking of otaku as it appears in Ichi the Killer, I'm speaking of it as it was used 20 years ago. And specifically, kind of, this is a little bit before kind of this rise in US consumption of Japanese culture en masse. So this is kind of before like anime became very big in the US and before all of the Hollywood remakes of films like The Ring and such that kind of brought this term into use. The way that it was originally used is derogatory. Like the implication is that an otaku is a single man who is over the age of like 25. He should be working. He doesn't have a job. He should be married. He doesn't have a wife. He should be dating. He doesn't have a girlfriend. And is specifically kind of reclusive, very addicted to media consumption. This is around the same time that Japan is experiencing this huge technological boom, right? With the rise of video game culture and DVDs and just a huge mass of media that didn't exist before with, you know, the rise of Nintendo and stuff. And so like the implication is that this is the guy that sits in his parents' basement, contributing nothing larger to the family structure, playing video games and consuming manga and having waifus, you know, these kind of like fictional girls who he imagines and fantasizes himself with, but never actually, like they're not real, which we see kind of being commentated on as well with Ichi and Sailor, who is the sex worker who he's kind of made up this whole relationship with in his head, even though he's you know it's terrible. But yeah, so that's like the original usage of it, and I think that that's the usage that the film is definitely like sticking to, because there isn't another usage yet. When it came to the US, and the US started getting involved in anime and consumption of Japanese culture, the way that it was taken was an otaku was a anime fan. Very specifically, like just an American fan of anime. And for some reason, that's kind of like, I don't know like what got lost in translation there, but like I can't really, you know, claim that like otakus are, you know, consuming Japanese culture in the way that it's meant to be intended. A lot of it is, you know, very much appropriative and like not respectful of the original conditions. So like the otaku as we kind of understand it today is an anime fan, but like an extreme one, like
Okay.
Japanophile, right?
Okay, okay. Because yeah, there's even like a isn't there like a site or like a publication called Otaku?
Yeah, there's a couple. There's a
Okay.
couple. I'm not a weeb. You know,
Yeah, that's another
I
term
think
I just learned recently.
yeah, I think that like now that I'm thinking of it, I think that the evolution of the term has been like it came to the US, it was called otaku, and now we call it weeb.
Okay,
And it's
okay.
kind of like the same thing. It has like that same implication of just being this large consumer of Japanese culture, but not actually Japanese culture.
Right, right.
So yeah.
It reminds me of that SNL sketch where it's like the two like college kids that are super into like Japanese pop culture and their professors like this is offensive guys like
Yeah,
anyway.
literally that's what it is. That's what it is. And it's something that like I'm always like super cautious of, like when I'm trying to like navigate East Asian extreme cinema as well, because there is, like, you know, I'm thinking, you know, Tarantino, right? We kind of have like this association with like the way that Tarantino appropriates culture, and the way that like Kill Bill is kind of constructed around like this appropriation of Japanese culture. That's kind of like what I try to avoid when I'm consuming media, right? That like, because like I want to be able to praise and respect Ichi the Killer, but I don't want to sit here and be, you know, the Tarantino of Ichi the Killer. That's not my that's not my space.
Another question I had for you is as I was watching the film, it's like it does seem like they try and pathologize the character's behavior, like, oh, this person is super violent because of this thing that happened to them or because of this thing. And I couldn't tell if like it was leaning too much on trying to explain and not justify, but I guess just, you know, contextualize the behavior, or if it was actually kind of resisting that, because we do find out that that story you referenced of Ichi being bullied, and we find out that that's not real later on. So yeah, I couldn't tell if it is saying like, no, it's not that that explains the violent behavior because that didn't even happen. You know, there is really no explanation besides learning it from other men and it being tied to sexuality. So, um, yeah, I am just a little curious to explore that a little further because I couldn't really tell. And maybe that's part of, maybe it's ambivalent about it or ambiguous about it.
Yeah, I definitely like get the impression as well that it is like a little bit ambiguous because I think that the film is kind of like walking this weird line where it like wants to be really just like this really strong cultural critique of violence, but at the same time like it wants to acknowledge kind of like personal it wants to tackle violence on a systematic level, but it also wants to acknowledge like the personal. So like it kind of like does this thing where it's like the violence is systematic, they're contributing to systematic violence, but the individual stories of the characters is why that they're doing it, but like it doesn't change the fact that they're doing it. And I think that it does get like really muddled and it doesn't quite land. I don't know if this was again like an issue of like the adaptation from like the manga where like maybe the manga kind of got like more into the backstories of these characters that the film only just kind of touched on a little bit. um I'm not really sure because like I personally I don't need explanation, like, but that's like a me thing. I can just go into a film and I don't care really. Like you don't have to explain it to me, I'll just watch it. I don't ask questions. Like I don't need to know like the larger like yeah, it's like so I yeah, I'm not sure. I think that the inclusion of the that particular bullying scene with Ichi, I think that that is um a relatively significant inclusion just in general as part of a critique, because like high school rape is a thing and it is like very prevalent and not very many things to my knowledge address it. The only other film that I can think of that's kind of dealing with that would be Battle Royale, which kind of um, mentions it a little bit, but doesn't go far enough as to really delve into a critique of this. Um, but yeah, it's interesting, especially since like we know that there was an issue in Japan where cell phones are different now because people were taking stealth photographs of schoolgirl uniform form upskirt. Like if you're taking a photo on your camera and your phone is Japanese, it makes a noise. No matter what you do, whenever you take a photo, and that's part of that. So I think that it is kind of like critiquing on this like over sexualization of teenage girls, but I don't know like how that's meant to really kind of uh yeah shift the tide there in terms of explaining anything.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny you bring that up because somebody just told me about um, a movie that kind of deals with that, and I'm blanking on the name now, but it sounds interesting. He was telling me it's like a 4-hour Japanese film where it's like it kind of takes place with like somebody who does that. So anyway, I'll try and think of the title and maybe Marty can punch it in. But um, yeah, you know, just on the topic of sexuality, you mentioned how like you're working with it in terms of queer sexuality as well. And I definitely got hints of that, one of the other syndicate members like confronts Kakihara like, "Oh, you love the boss." And like not in a gay way or not in like a sentimental way, but it's like you like when he hurts you and hits you, like you like that. And then there is just like this almost the cat and mouse part of like him trying to find Ichi. It's like it is almost kind of erotic in a way, like, and then their showdown, it's like he enjoys it, like um yeah, I lost my train of thought, but basically I did get some like hints of that, and am wondering how that works into your research because I know you're looking into how horror films deal with queer sexuality and gender.
Yeah, this is probably like one of my favorite things about Miike horror films that I don't really know has been like to my knowledge it hasn't really been widely explored in general, but my two favorites, Ichi the Killer and Gozu, are both Yakuza tales. And there's homoeroticism throughout the and Gozu in particular has a character who's trans, and who transitions within the narrative. So it's interesting that Miike has kind of chosen this space of ultra violence and gangs and hyper masculine gang spaces as being a place to kind of like explore sexuality and explore like homosexuality. And it kind of like reminds me of this is gonna be like the strangest. I'm not gonna like explain myself. This is gonna be like the strangest like cross-cultural comparison you've ever heard in your life. This is like the biggest reach of the century, but like also not really. So like I'm thinking of another extreme cinema film that we have in the US. Well, it's a UK film, Hellraiser, right? So Hellraiser is kind of lauded as being a queer horror film. The creator, Clive Barker, is queer, but the film itself is BDSM based, and there are no queer characters, at least to my knowledge and my consumption of Hellraiser, within the actual context of Hellraiser. The queerness is constructed through the through the consumption of BDSM and the participation of BDSM, right? This is something we see a little bit of in like William Friedkin's Cruising too, where at this point in time, I think BDSM is queer because the spaces are combined, right? These are two different quote unquote sex perversions at their time, and so the spaces interact. Like you can be straight and practicing BDSM, but that space is still viewed as a quote unquote sexual perversion, and so it's put into queer space. So I think that that's kind of like where I'm getting like Ichi the Killer, right? So like we never see Anju, we never see boss Anju, we never see Anju interacting with Kakihara. Even in flashbacks, we never see the relationship. The only place that like we see their relationship like most explored would be in that scene between Kakihara and Karen, where he's having Karen torture him, right? So this is kind of the relationship that we're getting between Kakihara and Anju, is that Kakihara likes to be hurt and Anju likes to hurt him, and together that is a sexual experience that they share. And it's something that like Kakihara is seeking from Ichi, right? That's what he wants. Is he wants to meet Ichi because Ichi is going to hurt him, and that's what he wants. And so it's a very interesting kind of like, this is queer in that we're seeing two men performing this action together with each other, but also like queer on just a level of BDSM being like a non-conventional sexual act, right? And it's something that like that Miike explores in other films as well, that I find like really interesting, is that like this is a space where that continuously happens, this overlap of like hyper masculinity and yeah, and sex and hyper violent sex. So it's, yeah, it's so multi-layered. It's like 8 different levels of like queer theory and sexuality, and but it's yeah, it's interesting, and I'm constantly like consumed by this, right?
Yeah, no, and it is layered because it's like on the one hand, Ichi is uh a bit of a sadist, but on the other hand, he cries a lot and like gets made fun of and chastised for crying. And like there's points where he's like, I don't want to kill anymore. Like I don't know. It's like he has the capacity for violence for sure, but there are also moments where, and I think this gets what you're getting to previously, like when the violence is too real, it's like that's when when he starts crying and like kind of breaks down, like kind of towards the end.
Yeah, and I think that that's kind of like what makes the ending of the film like really stand out to me, is because like it's like the whole film is setting up for this confrontation between Kakihara and Ichi, and Kakihara has an expectation of Ichi that we know isn't like, just is not the reality of Ichi, right? Like he's like, Kakihara is picturing, you know, this guy who is able to overcome Basanju, and so is picturing like this hyper masculine, hyper violent person who enjoys doing violence, and enjoys doing violence to a level that is even more than what Kakihara has ever experienced before. Because Ichi, when he kills people, and this is like that comic book element of it, he's not just killing people, he's like the whole room is like pieces of them. Like it's like an explosion went off, and then you're like kind of watching it and you're like, there's no way a person just did this. Like that's not a realistic way that like people die. And so like he's like literally like chasing like this supernatural force of violence that Ichi has the capacity for and has committed, but like mentally is just not into that. um but he is like, but like what Ichi is seemingly into is he's really into voyeurism, right? Because this is, getting back to like that audience watching the violence and consuming the violence. He seems just like really into voyeurism. And we see that like constantly he likes to watch violence, so maybe like this relationship could have worked out in a way where like Kakihara as the enforcer is, committing acts of violence, and in the ideal world Ichi is like watching him as one of the assistants or something like that, and that could have worked. Except that that's not the kind of relationship that Kakihara wants. And so this showdown is like the least climactic showdown of like all time. Like Ichi is like on the ground crying, and like Kakihara is like, "What are you doing? Like, get up! Like, what is
Yeah,
your problem?"
exactly.
He's like, "Who is this man?"
It is, and it goes on for a while too. Like he's crying on the ground for a while. I think he maybe even wets himself, or is he bleeding? I couldn't tell. But at any point, it is like really pathetic in every sense of the word. Like he's just sort of like, dude, come on, like fight me. Like kind of like the scene in Monty Python where the two knights are fighting. He's like, come on, let's do it. And yeah, no, it is watching the film through this lens, like through we've been talking about, does I feel like enrich the experience, because otherwise it is sort of like, why am I watching this like cruelty and violence happen? But there is some substance to it for sure.
Yeah, and I think that that's the hard part of the film is that well I think it's the hard part of basically every film of this genre, right? Is trying to figure out what the commentary is, if there is any. And I'm not going to claim that there is some in every film. I've definitely watched a lot that was like, I don't know if this was really commentary or if this was just like maybe we can comment on um like the merit of the experimental film style instead, right? Where it's like we got to talk about the form instead of the narrative. But I think that in this case, like it has a really strong narrative. It's doing a lot. It's been banned in a lot of countries because of that. Like the UK being one in particular, where they specifically had banned it because of like the savagery of the film was like how it was done. They ended up like cutting a lot of it, but I think Hong Kong had cut like 20 minutes of it, um, which was I think like the longest cut that I can think of that's been done to a film like this, because it is very intense. So it's like, yeah, I think it takes multiple watches. I think it takes like really close watches, and with this being a film of its nature, close watching can be really difficult. And so yeah, it's definitely one where it's like sometimes I feel like you need a guide, a little
Yeah,
booklet.
totally, totally. Yeah, I remember watching it for the first time, and my friend was like, "This is like one of the most messed up movies I've ever seen, so just be ready." Like he definitely prepped us, and yeah, even then it was like I felt prepared, but not necessarily to follow along and like understand it through the way we've been talking about it. So no, yeah, I think we've had a great discussion about this film. So I don't know any. I was gonna say any last words, but that sounds a little too fatalistic. So any
Yeah.
any any bits of wisdom you want to go out on before we conclude?
Um, Not really. Just I would say like give it a watch. Like I think that this is one of those films that it's like, I always like encourage people to watch films like at least once, just to just kind of give it a try. I wouldn't say that this is Salo. Like I wouldn't say that this is like the Japanese Salo where it's like you have to watch this film. But I think that it's really good. I think that it's worth looking at critically. I think that it's worth looking at as a film that is doing a lot and has been like really like yeah, it's just been like really underappreciated for its attempt. um and it's by a fantastic filmmaker. And like, if you haven't seen any of Miike's films other than Audition, the dude's got like 100 films. Like, he's a very prolific filmmaker. So it definitely, like, there's something there. Like, he's made like
Yeah.
family friendly films. He's
Right.
made like kids films.
Yeah, and like comedies and
Yeah, he's got
yeah.
everything. He's got everything. And I think that he has like a really unique kind of directorial approach. And I think he shines the most doing this kind of like hyper violence. I think he shines the most doing Yakuza stories in particular. And yeah, like this is like, prolific filmmaker, fantastic film from this filmmaker. And what more could you ask for,
Yeah, totally. Well, thanks for doing this, Alex. This was fun. And yeah, we'll have to get together and talk about another Miike film down the road because I have been slowly chipping away at his massive filmography. So that would be fun.
Next time, Gozu.
Yeah, exactly. Keep your eye out for that one, folks.
That's it for our show this week. Thank you for listening and for your support. Please subscribe to the show on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at Cineposium and on Twitter at Cposium to keep up with our updates and to keep in communication with us. Until next week, take care, everyone.